My name is Helen Wilson, and I am 39 years old. My life at first glance might seem ideal. A beautiful home in the quiet suburbs of Madison, Wisconsin, a well-off husband, 2 children. But behind this pretty picture lay an emptiness that I had long tried to ignore. My husband, Peter, a successful lawyer, had become increasingly consumed by his work over the years. His time was spent on court cases, calls, and trips. Even at home, he was rarely truly present. His fingers almost always slid across the phone screen, and his gaze darted between messages and urgent matters. He had become like a ghost to me, physically present but emotionally unreachable. Our children, our eldest son Daniel, who had recently turned 21, and our younger daughter Sophia, 13. Sophia spent most of her time with friends or engrossed in teenage interests in her room. And Daniel, young and energetic, was already living his own life. He decided to drop out of college after 2 years, explaining that he wanted to work and become independent. Peter didn't object. He always said that everyone should choose their own path. I tried to support Daniel, even though I couldn't understand why he rejected the opportunities we provided for him. This summer, Daniel got a job at a local store near our home. He would return home by noon tired but content. The heat those days was unbearable. The air seemed stagnant, and even the slightest breeze felt like a blessing. The house, our refuge from the outside world, became stuffy and heavy. That day, as always, Peter left early in the morning, quickly throwing me the usual, "See you tonight." The house was enveloped in silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. I stood by the window watching the trees sway slowly under the scorching sun. Each new day resembled the previous one, and I felt the monotony of life pulling me in like quicksand. By noon, footsteps sounded on the driveway. It was Daniel returning from work. I watched as he crossed the yard. His shirt clung to his body, his hair was damp with sweat. He always reminded me of a younger Peter. The same confident gaze, the same strength evident in every movement. But there was something different about Daniel, something inexplicable that made me look at him a little longer than I should. "Mom, it's hellishly hot out here," he said, entering and tossing his keys on the table. "Get some water," I suggested, smiling, though a feeling I couldn't name was already stirring within me. Daniel went to the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and sat down on a chair. We sat in silence. I watched him surreptitiously, not daring to meet his gaze. I tried to focus on something else, but my thoughts kept returning to how much he had grown up over the past few years. The room was quiet, with only the faint hum of the fan. The silence always weighed on me, filling the space with a strange, inexplicable emptiness. Later, trying to cope with the stuffiness, I decided to take a shower. Climbing the stairs, I noticed that the bathroom door was slightly ajar. At first, I thought it was Sophia, but after a few steps, I realized it was Daniel inside. The sound of running water and faint singing came through the doorway. I froze as if rooted to the spot. My heart quickened its pace, though I couldn't understand why. Stepping back, I accidentally knocked over a mop leaning against the wall, which crashed to the floor. This sound seemed to wake me from a strange stupor. Grabbing the mop, I hurried downstairs, hoping he hadn't noticed anything. Back in the living room, I tried to calm down, but the trembling in my hands and the intrusive images wouldn't leave me alone. When Daniel came out of the bathroom, wrapped only in a towel, I felt a flush of shame spread across my face. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual, and I quickly averted my eyes. "Mom, is everything okay?" "I heard a noise," he asked with a slight smile. "Yes, everything's fine. Just the mop fell," I replied, trying to speak calmly. But deep down I knew something had changed at that moment. It was as if a crack had run through the wall that I had so carefully built between myself and my desires. The loneliness that had nested within me for years suddenly became much more palpable, awakening emotions that had no place. That night I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. My entire life, which had seemed so established, suddenly began to crumble under the weight of inexplicable feelings. The image of Daniel, how he laughs, how he sits at the table, how he looks at me, haunted me, awakening memories of youth, of times when I felt alive. But with each new memory came a heavy, oppressive sense of guilt. "Helen, you're losing your mind," I whispered to myself in the darkness. "This is wrong. This is madness." But the truth was that behind this inner struggle lay something more. A desire to be noticed, heard to feel needed. Deep down, I knew that this desire was leading me to the abyss, but I couldn't make myself step back. The next morning I woke up early. Peter had already left, as usual, leaving behind a cold cup of coffee and the scent of cologne. I stood by the bedroom window, watching the sun slowly rise over the rooftops of the neighboring houses. The silence of the house, which once seemed soothing, now felt like a heavy burden. It no longer brought comfort. It reminded me of my loneliness. I went downstairs to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea and started preparing breakfast. Sophia was still asleep, and Daniel was still in his room. I tried to convince myself that the previous day was just a coincidence, a misunderstanding that would never happen again. But the more I tried to forget, the more the thoughts of that moment consumed me. When Daniel finally emerged from his room, his hair was still tousled from sleep. He sat down at the table across from me, taking a cup of coffee. His gaze was calm, but I sensed something elusive in his eyes. He looked at me longer than usual, and then smiled softly, almost mockingly. "Mom, you look different today," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "Different how?" I tried to smile to hide my sudden embarrassment. "Just different," he replied, shrugging slightly and shifted his gaze to the window. His words stuck in my head. Daniel had never said such things before. I tried to brush it off, attribute it to coincidence, but the feeling of anxiety mixed with something inexplicably warm wouldn't leave me. After breakfast, Daniel offered to help me with the garden. We rarely spent time together, so I agreed with joy. The heat was already intensifying, but in the shade of the trees it was bearable. We worked in silence, occasionally exchanging short phrases. I watched as he deftly trimmed the bushes, his movements confident and focused. At one point he took off his shirt, tossing it onto the fence, and continued working. I felt my face flush, but not from the sun. "You're working too hard," I muttered to ease the tension. "I just want to help you," he replied, turning around. "You do so much for us." His words sounded sincere, and this made me feel something strange, joy and heaviness at the same time. I realized that I hadn't heard anything like this from Peter in a long time. He always considered my care for the home and family as just part of my duties, something that didn't need to be talked about. After the work was done, we returned to the house. I made lemonade and we sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, softly illuminating the room. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his job, about the people he meets every day, about his dreams. I listened, marveling at how much he had changed over the past few years. Daniel was no longer the boy who used to hide behind my skirt when he was scared. He had become a man, confident, strong, independent. "And you? What do you dream about, Mom?" he suddenly asked, interrupting his stream of stories. The question caught me off guard. I froze, trying to come up with an answer, but my mind was blank. I don't know," I finally said, lowering my eyes. "I think my dreams stayed somewhere in the past." "Why?" He leaned closer, his voice serious. "Can't you dream at any age?" "I guess you can," I replied, smiling, but it was a smile only on the surface. His words struck a chord. I realized that I had long stopped thinking about myself. My life had always revolved around the family, caring for the children, and supporting my husband. I was like a shadow in their world, forgetting that I too had desires and needs. Later, trying to finally rest, I lay down on the living room couch, closing my eyes, trying to banish all thoughts, but the silence made me think of Daniel again. His smile, his voice, his gaze. All of it filled me, crowding out any other feelings. I hated myself for it, for the thoughts that began to arise. It was wrong. It was madness. But deep down, I felt that the crack in my life was growing wider, and I no longer knew how to close it. By evening, when Sophia had gone to bed and Peter was still at work, Daniel approached me. I was sitting on the porch enjoying the cool night air. He sat down next to me, handing me a cup of tea. "Mom, I know what you're feeling," he suddenly said, his voice soft but firm. I froze, not understanding what he meant. "You're alone," he continued, not looking at me. "I see it. And it hurts me to know that you live like this." His words hit me like a punch. I couldn't reply because it was the truth. He was always more observant than I thought. His perceptiveness both frightened and attracted me. "You're not alone, Mom," he added after a long pause. I'm always here. I felt something inside me break. His words penetrated deeper than I wanted to admit. It was a crack that was growing wider, threatening to tear my life apart. The next few days I tried to keep my distance from Daniel. I convinced myself that it was the right decision, that I needed to spend more time with Sophia, or just immerse myself in household chores to distract myself. But the more I tried to avoid my son, the more I felt his presence. Even when he was in another room, I knew he was somewhere nearby. One evening, when Peter was delayed at another meeting, Daniel suggested watching a movie. I wanted to refuse, but his smile, his insistence made refusal impossible. We settled on the living room couch. The light in the room was dimmed, the television screen flickered, casting shadows on the walls. Daniel sat close enough for me to feel the warmth of his body. Every time he laughed at a funny moment, I caught myself unable to look away from him. Halfway through the movie, he suddenly turned to me. Mom, have you ever thought that life could be different? That you could be different? I turned my head and our eyes met. There was something deep, elusive in his gaze that made me feel vulnerable. What do you mean? I asked, trying to sound calm. I don't know, he replied with a slight smile. It's just that sometimes it seems like you're living a life you don't want. I see it. His words hit me again. I knew he was right. Every day I felt like I was losing myself, turning into something functional rather than alive. But what could I say? That I didn't know how to escape the cage I had built for myself? By the end of the movie, I felt completely drained. Daniel seemed to notice this. He turned off the TV and turned to me. You've always been the strongest for me, Mom, he said. Even when it was tough for me, you always found the strength to support me. Now I want to support you. His words were sincere, but their meaning sounded different from what they should have. I felt a chill run down my spine. Too many emotions were intertwined at that moment, and I didn't know how to control them. The next day I went for a walk alone. I needed space to sort out my thoughts. Walking a few blocks, I stopped at a playground. Children's laughter filled the air, evoking a strange sense of longing. Once I too was younger, carefree, not thinking about how to keep the family afloat, how to be the perfect wife and mother. I remembered Daniel as a little boy, how he ran to me with outstretched arms, how his laughter filled the house. But now everything had changed. He had grown up, and with that, my perception of him had changed. We both had become different, and it scared me. That evening, I decided to talk to Peter. When he returned from work, I tried to get his attention. Peter, we need to talk, I began, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. Sure, about what? He didn't even look up, engrossed in his phone. I feel like we've become too distant from each other. You're always busy. I miss what we used to be. He finally looked up, but his gaze was tired, as if he didn't understand what I was talking about. Helen, you're exaggerating, he said, shaking his head. I'm just going through a busy period. Everything will be fine. But I knew it wasn't. This was his standard response, which he had been repeating for many years. Disappointed, I stood up and went to the bedroom, feeling the gap between us growing wider. That night, I heard someone walking around the house. Coming out of the bedroom, I saw the light on in the living room. It was Daniel. He was sitting on the couch, leaning back with an empty gaze fixed on the ceiling. There was a bottle of beer in his hand, but it looked untouched. Why aren't you sleeping? I asked, approaching. Couldn't sleep, he replied, not changing his position. You either. Yes, I admitted, sitting down next to him. We sat in silence. I felt the heavy atmosphere enveloping us. Daniel suddenly turned to me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the lamp. Mom, you understand what I feel. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Everything I had been trying to ignore finally became clear. Daniel, this is wrong, I whispered, unable to look him in the eye. Why? Because someone decided so. His voice became sharper. I know you feel the same. His words, like sharp knives, pierced my soul. I wanted to object, but I couldn't. He was right. Deep down I knew he was right. When he came closer, I didn't move. I felt his breath, heard his heartbeat. Everything inside me screamed to stop this, but I was paralyzed, captured by the conflict between reason and emotions. You're not alone, Mom, he repeated, and his voice was no longer boyish but confident, almost adult. I stood up and left, not saying a word. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words, his gaze, his closeness. This crack that had appeared in my life had turned into an abyss. The next morning I woke up late. My head felt heavy on the pillow, and sleep brought no relief. The days blended into a monotonous routine, but everything had changed after the previous night. What had been stirring inside me had either broken or perhaps opened up. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a misunderstanding, that my feelings were temporary, and Daniel's words were a mistake. But the more I tried to reject them, the stronger they became. Daniel came home at noon as always. His morning shifts at the store were over, and he brought the usual bag of groceries. I heard the door open, but I didn't come out of my room. I knew I couldn't look him in the eye after what had happened. I heard his footsteps, how he walked around the kitchen, how he poured himself water. Eventually he came to my door and knocked. "Mom, is everything okay? You haven't come out all day." I took a deep breath and tried to steady my voice. "Everything's fine, just a little tired," I replied, but I knew my voice wavered. He didn't leave immediately. His shadow lingered under the door. I waited, holding my breath, not knowing what he would say or do. A moment later, he softly said, "If something's not right, you can talk to me." His voice was gentle, almost soothing. I knew he genuinely wanted to help, but it only increased my confusion. Why did I, a mother, feel so vulnerable before my own son? That evening I decided to go outside to get some fresh air. The summer air was still warm, but a gentle breeze brought welcome coolness. Sitting on the swing in our yard, I looked at the stars, trying to find answers. Every time I closed my eyes, Daniel's image appeared before me. His words, his gaze, his touch. All of it was stuck in my memory, like a grain of sand that couldn't be shaken off. Daniel came out and sat next to me. I didn't even notice him until he spoke. "You're thinking about what I said yesterday," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice. I didn't answer. I just looked at the night sky, praying for him to be silent, for this topic to never be brought up again. But he didn't back down. "Mom, I know you feel the same." His voice was low but confident. "Daniel, stop," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. "We can't talk about this. It's wrong." "Why?" "Because that's what other people say. You feel it. You can't deny it." I stood up abruptly, feeling my emotions boil over. I couldn't take his words anymore. They penetrated too deeply, shattering all the barriers I had tried to build. "Daniel, this has to stop. You have to understand that this is wrong." "You're my son," I said, desperately hoping my words would reach him. He stood up too. His gaze was intense, piercing. He took a step closer and I felt my heart race. "You always said that family is everything we have," he said. "So why do you feel so alone?" His words struck at the very pain I had so carefully hidden. I couldn't answer because he was right. I was alone. So alone that I might not have noticed how I began seeking solace in the one closest to me. After that conversation, I felt that something new had emerged between us, something that couldn't be ignored. We both understood that we had crossed a line, but neither of us could step back. Over the next few days I avoided him. I found excuses not to stay home. Sophia was my only salvation. Her lessons, her school projects became my anchor in reality. But Daniel seemed to understand what I was doing. "You're running from me," he said one day when we were alone. "I'm just busy," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "You're afraid," he stated bluntly. "Afraid of what you feel." I didn't answer. I turned away, but I knew he saw my weakness. With each passing day, he became more insistent, and I lost more control. One evening, when Peter was again delayed at work, I was sitting in the kitchen trying to distract myself with a book. Daniel came in, poured himself some water, and sat down across from me. He was silent, but his presence was overwhelming. "Mom," he finally said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I turned around. His face was tense, but his eyes held regret. "You were right," he continued. "We can't go on like this. I need time to sort myself out." His words hit me like a blow. I knew it was right, but it still hurt. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It's the best decision," I replied, and my words sounded confident, even if I didn't believe them myself. A few days later, Daniel announced that he was leaving. He said he had found a job in another city and wanted to start fresh. I knew it was the only way out, but it didn't make the goodbye any easier. On the day of his departure, I stood by the window and watched him drive away in his old pickup. My heart was breaking, but I couldn't stop him. That night, I felt for the first time in a long time how truly quiet the house was. This silence was no longer filled with tension. It was empty, and this emptiness reminded me of what I had lost.